Beautiful theater on campus. Awesome, isn't it? Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for coming to this very important event. This is the second annual Marshall Loeb Lecture in Digital Innovation. I had the honor of giving the first one. My name is Sri Srinivasan, and I'm a professor here, a visiting professor, the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Communications and Journalism. And I had the pleasure and honor of sharing my thoughts now almost 18 months ago about where we are with everything that's happening in the pandemic and beyond. Today, we are going to have a chance to get an update on where things are going, and you're about to hear from someone who is one of the most exciting minds in journalism today. You all know that we ask when we see some people we haven't met in a while, how's your pandemic been going? I don't like that question because it implies that the pandemic is over when you know that there are 2,000 Americans dying every single day. I also don't like it because everyone has had a different type of pandemic. And for most of us, just surviving, just getting through these last 2 years has been an important milestone for us. Which brings me to today's speaker, who you will be meeting, and why we're all here today. Someone in this room, who you will be meeting, has done the following during these last 2 years. She quit one of the most influential jobs in global journalism. She got her 17-year-old through the SATs, college tours, and the admissions process while waiting for her younger daughter to be eligible for vaccines. She hosted countless socially distant and masked meals in her Queens home, even in 20-degree weather, just because people needed her and each other. She took care of her aging parents and in-laws as they navigated various life milestones, including selling and moving away from her childhood home. She started an innovative startup for Black and brown folks that got funding from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Yes, Meghan and Harry, you may have heard of them. She also helped vaccinate more than 10,000 people in New York City by getting them appointments where they didn't know how or couldn't navigate the bureaucracy. She realized that if you truly want to serve your readers, as we say in journalism, maybe helping keep them alive is the highest form of service of all. And we'll get a chance to hear about her thoughts on all of those things and how she did it all with a kind smile and deep, deep empathy. But before that, before you meet Mitra Kalita, who I hope you're all following on Twitter, she's at Mitra Kalita, you will hear from our president. And we're so delighted that she's able to be with us today. This is the 6th president of Stony Brook University, and she joined us in July of 2020 at the peak of the pandemic. Can't imagine what that hiring process was like for her. And as chief executive of Stony Brook, she oversees Stony Brook Medicine, Long Island's premier academic medical center, which encompasses 5 health sciences schools, 4 hospitals, and 200 community-based healthcare settings. And she's a key player in furthering economic development on Long Island and in Stony Brook's role as part of the management team for the nearby Brookhaven National Lab, and so much more. When I asked, what should I say about her bio, what should I read from a bio, she said, just say, it's the president of the university. So please welcome President Maury McInnes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sri. It is really my pleasure to be here in the Wong Center, to see people assembled, and to have you all attending our annual Marshall R. Loeb Lecture. As our campus returns to in-person work, learning, and engagement, I have to say it is events like this that I have missed the most. Events that bring groups together for discovery and intellectual inquiry. Events that inspire action and growth. Events that have a palpable sense of excitement in the air. I'd like to thank Michael Loeb and loeb.nyc for this incredible partnership and for empowering the Stony Brook School of Communication and Journalism to enhance its capacity in new forms of entrepreneurial journalism and media. This is a partnership we cherish, and we are eager to see it grow and expand. Because just as higher education across the globe returns to in-person learning and activities, the world is recovering from a tumultuous past 2 years. 2 years where the news changed every hour, where critical health information was often in flux, where learning new ways to communicate was essential, where ways of life, connection, and commerce had to be reinvented, and where trust in certain systems and media outlets dwindled. The work of the School of Communication and Journalism will be essential as we rebuild an innovative and inclusive new chapter in communication, journalism, and digital media. So thank you to Michael Loeb for joining us in this chapter. Michael started his career in publishing and media at Time Inc. and eventually co-founded the largest seller of consumer magazine subscriptions in the world, Synapse, which also acted as the incubator for Priceline.com. After selling Synapse Group to Time Warner, Michael went on to form Loeb Enterprises, which eventually became Loeb NYC. Loeb NYC's Manhattan headquarters are a people-first investment group, pairing some of the world's most innovative startups with strategic leadership, talent, and capital to make transformative entrepreneurial visions a reality. Margaret and Michael Loeb established this partnership with Stony Brook University in honor of Michael's father, Marshall R. Loeb, the former managing editor of both Fortune and Money magazines, and one of the most influential editors in publishing history. Their incredible support has enabled Stony Brook to build a world-class community of communicators, journalism, and media innovation. It has empowered us to hire faculty who are reinventing digital media, offer our students important internships at Loeb NYC, and invite the world's leading journalists and entrepreneurs like Mitra Kalita to come to our campus and share their knowledge and vision for our collective future. Mitra, I am so looking forward to hearing you speak, and I know our entire community shares in my gratitude to have you here. Together, I know that the bright, innovative minds of Loeb NYC, the Stony Brook School of Communication and Journalism, and our rich collection of writers and innovators will both explore and define what the future of communication and media may look like for the benefit of Long Island, New York State, and beyond. It's an inspiring, no, critical time to be in communication and journalism, and we are so excited to see what happens next. So, before we begin this afternoon's lecture with Mitra Kalita, co-founder of URI, media founder of Epicenter-NYC, former senior vice president of CNN Digital, author and columnist to Fortune, I'd like to invite Dean Laura Linenfeld to the podium to speak. Thank you.
Hello, my goodness, an in-person event. Happy Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day to all who celebrate. I knew I was gonna do that. I don't wanna go back. I don't wanna relive winter. Good afternoon. I'm Laura Linenfeld, Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism and Director of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. We're actually waiting for Michael Loeb to show up. He got caught in traffic, so he was gonna precede me. We're gonna have him jump in when he gets here because I'd really like you to meet him, and I know he wants to meet you. It's really my pleasure to be in person. How many in-person events have you been to in the last 6 months? 0? Well, welcome to this one. I'm so thrilled you're here. I'd like to take a moment to thank WSHU Public Radio for their continued sponsorship of our lecture series, President McGinnis for her support and wonderful remarks, Professor Sri Srinivasan, our inaugural Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation, and our fabulous MC for this event, and Michael Loeb for his tremendous commitment to our school. It really has made a huge difference. Thank you for providing our students with so many opportunities, Michael. We're really grateful. I'm honored now to introduce you to S. Mitra Kalita. Mitra is a journalist, media executive, digital media innovator, and author. I think you're going to find her mesmerizing and awesome. She recently launched Epicenter-NYC, a newsletter to help New Yorkers get through the pandemic, and she really has had a profound effect. She also co-founded a new media company called URL Media, a network of Black and Brown-owned media organizations that share content, distribution, and revenue to increase long-term sustainability. So cool. To name just a few of Mitra's past roles, and you heard a bit before from Sri, she's been the Senior Vice President for News, Programming, and Opinion at CNN Digital, Managing Editor for Editorial Strategy at the LA Times, and Executive Editor at Large for Quartz, overseeing the launches of Quartz India and Quartz Africa. We also have to note that Mitra was raised on Long Island, in addition to Puerto Rico and New York, and spent some of her early career as a Newsday business reporter. Howie, I see you out there, I believe. You and Mitra worked together. I heard a little about that. So Mitra, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I'm so delighted you're here and would like to welcome you to the stage. Give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Can you hear me, first of all? Yes. Lovely. It's lovely to see all of you, and it's even great to see you, Howie Schneider. So thank you. This is actually one of my first in-person events, and I can't tell you just how grateful I am to be the only second Marshall Loeb speaker in this series. And it really means more to me than I can convey. And just kind of as proof of that, I just warn you that I'm sort of in a very odd transition in my life right now. I've just come to you via New Jersey, where my mother-in-law is actually in hospice. And she's on the last leg of her journey, and I was able to clear my schedule of most things. And I just want to be super candid with you. I kind of thought about canceling this appearance as well, because when your mother-in-law is, she's in her final days, what's important? And two things stopped me, and that's really what I wanted to begin with, and then we'll dive into digital innovation. But one is that for the last 18 years that I've been married, and I've been a mother for 17 and a half of that exactly, there's never been a speech or travel or a work event or a meeting or a conference or anything that I haven't been able to do because of backup from my own mother or my mother-in-law. And just to have that support as a woman working in media, initially as a reporter where the hours feel endless, but then when you get into the executive ranks, they're really, really endless. To have these two women who've been singularly committed to my career has been all affirming, and I would not be on this stage without that support. There's just no question. None of you would have, asked me to come do this if I didn't have that backup. The second reason really relates to a tragic connection to Marshall Loeb himself, who died of Parkinson's disease in 2017. And it happens to be the same disease that my mother-in-law was just diagnosed with. And she was diagnosed kind of late. She'd been not doing so well. So unfortunately, that diagnosis came too late. And so, I really do come to you with this connection that was unexpected. I agreed to do this lecture before I, went down the Google rabbit hole of Marshall Loeb's, of course I'm familiar with him journalistically, but it was before all this recent personal stuff in my life. And so I kind of come to you in a moment, and Sri talked about everybody having a very different pandemic. So much of my pandemic has been keeping my parents and my in-laws alive. I imagine many of you share that kind of roll with me, but also uplifting my community and keeping them alive in the process, which is, of course, what we'll talk about today. But I did want to warn you that we might veer into a little bit more of life than digital innovation than you might have come expecting, although it is Valentine's Day, and I also kind of see us on a collective date right now. And so I'm gonna assume that all is forgiven and that it's okay to get vulnerable real fast because we are in a pandemic and we are indeed transitioning to not the end of the pandemic, as Sri reminds us, but this next phase of interactivity. So I think we can begin kind of diving into what I'm going to talk about today. So digital innovation is such a broad umbrella, and so I was trying to figure out, like, what can I concretely sort of unify this. And I came up with serving a world that's not only on Twitter, because sometimes it feels like journalists, and I know Sri just told you all to follow me, and I was like, that would be great if Stony Brook follows me, because you would double my followers on Twitter pretty much overnight. But I do think that what you're going to see in the next kind of 20, 30 minutes or so of laying out what I'm working on is really this desire to connect the real world with the digital world. Oh, I should go back to one thing. Hang on one second. Let me do that. I talked about being in community with all of you. I am scarily easy to find on the internet, but I did want to give you my email address, which is mitra@url-media.com. I talked about my kind of women that propelled my career, but the other thing that has really helped my career is that I answer email. And I encourage all of you who are like, I'm going to get to it later, just answer the email. So I give you my email address because indeed we are in community together today, and I hope that continues beyond just this lecture. So as three people have introduced me, which is like the most generous introduction I've ever gotten anywhere I've spoken, I have indeed worked everywhere. These are some of the places I've worked. And I can tell you, like, as we go through what I've launched, I rely on lessons from each of these places daily in my work. I met with a group of students at lunch, and one of the concerns was like, I like doing everything. How can I narrow it down? Or, what do I do first? And, my one kind of freeing advice would not be to see your next job as your last job. And so my ability to move around has really helped my career. And also, as you can see, I've geographically been able to be in a few different places, which is always great to have that perspective. This is what I call the humble brag slide, which actually you also heard a little bit about, but I have taught journalism. I've taught at Columbia, St. John's, CUNY's Grad School of Journalism, and UMass Amherst. And while I haven't done that over the last few years, it's been a really important part of my identity, just being able to always convene with the next generation of journalism students, not as much because I'm teaching, but because I'm really absorbing how are you consuming media and what can I glean from you. And so when I say stay in touch, like, I really do love to hear how you're getting your news and information. This is a really important part of my identity. I've won a few awards, including leading 2 teams to the Pulitzer Prizes at the LA Times and the Edward R. Murrow Award at CNN. And then I've written 2 books. And I share the books just not because we're in an academic setting, and hopefully you'll all take me a lot more seriously now because I don't have a PhD, but also because I'm a breaking news hound. I love news. It was my favorite part of working at CNN. But there's something about the immersive reporting style and the narrative journalism that a book necessitates that was really kind of career changing for me. And one aspect of that is because I think as journalists, we approach a story, we go back to write our story, and then we're kind of done, right? That's at least how it was for much of my career. There's nothing like book reporting when you go to somebody over and over and over again. And in both of these books, I followed different families to, in the first case, write about immigrants and their effect on the suburbs. In the second book, to write about India's economic liberalization. In the case of these families, when you go back over and over and over again, you realize that what was said in your first interview tends to be very different from your 10th interview. And for the most part, the journalism that we're reading every day is what was shared in that first interview. So this is kind of like the public face of me, right? So you might see me on social media. You might see some headlines, right? There was this Axios breaking the news of when URL Media was launched. Scoop ex-CNN executive starts media venture for communities of color. MIT Tech Review did a tiny media company is helping people get vaccinated. Within that story, they called us a business of the future. Neiman Lab has spotlighted us. Of course, they profile innovations in journalism and in digital. And then here, when Stony Brook announced that I would be giving this lecture. So this is kind of the public face. And I know so much of your careers of study in journalism, for those of you who are students, is really preoccupied with the brand that you're asserting. Right? What do we look like on social media? This person seems to be everywhere. How do I get Axios to write about my launch? And how come that guy raised $7 million and I only raised $7, right? So I just thought, in kind of continuing with the vulnerability that I'm coming to you with today, that while that is kind of the public face of how I've been spending the last year and a half, this is really what it feels like, which is, I hope nobody sees what's happening under the surface here. And it really is, I mean, I just told you a little bit about what's been going on in my personal life, but you have that, plus in my case, I'm running 2 businesses. I did have to get a kid into college, which, gosh, that's like, requires a whole nother level. But then there's the business itself. So journalism trains us for a certain aspect of, gathering a story. You input the story, there's an output in the form of an article. They don't really teach you about customer relationship management, customer acquisition, customer value propositions. You don't really learn about budgeting or forecasting. In my case, I had to read Phil Knight's Nike book to understand cash flow. So there's just a lot of aspects that I feel like I'm figuring out below the surface that are the parts that people don't really see. And what I'll try to do is just give you a very honest, this is what I launched in the realm of digital innovation, and this is how I'm trying to build the thing I'm trying to build. But I did want to be honest about figuring a lot of it out while I'm seemingly gliding along on the surface. So what did I launch, right? How did this whole thing start? So I think there's a button where I can show you. Oh, is that blurring my photo, or is it just, does it look like I'm a criminal, or is that just me looking at it? You all see that too? I swear to God, that was like a crystal clear photo when I sent this in. So that's my office at CNN, which you can't tell, but it was a great office. It was actually, Sri can attest, it was a big office. And I had Bollywood pictures behind. I'm so sorry you can't see it. If you want to see it, you have my email address. I'll send you a copy. But this was my life at CNN, right? I had a big office. I had a team of about 200 plus people. I was a senior vice president, and I ran the breaking news, opinion, features, programming, which is digital distribution, so pretty wide, and did I mention opinion? So it's a very large portfolio within CNN Digital, but of course, because I ran breaking news, I would also have to interface with our TV shows and talent and news gathering as well. It was a great job, and it was a comfortable job. We get to March of 2020, and I'm not alone in feeling changed by that period of time. And a few things happen. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, not too far from here, about 55 minutes or so. And Jackson Heights became termed the epicenter of the epicenter. The New York Times wrote about us, the trucks were outside Elmhurst Hospital, the sirens were kind of nonstop. And in that moment, I was between my parents' house in New Jersey, because my father had just had a second stroke, and between our home in Jackson Heights, going back and forth. And because my husband and I hope, have been good neighbors in that community of Jackson Heights, we started getting a lot of emails around how does this business navigate collecting unemployment? This was before what would eventually become known as PPP and additional assistance. And in this case, this is a man named Juan, who was my husband's bike mechanic. And through somebody who knew somebody, I got a WhatsApp message one day saying, Juan, who is a bike mechanic from Mexico, has no family in the country. Unfortunately, he passed away at Elmhurst Hospital. The city has his body. His family in Puebla, Mexico, wants to at least claim his body or claim his remains somehow, and nobody can help them. And so these email messages, where somebody has COVID, they need childcare, would be going around, and this is literally an example from Friday, April 10th, of about like 50 of us are on the subject line, and you could see their names, and I hope I'm not out. I think Shri might even be on there. And here's, while I have you all, Nathan is my husband, bike mechanic just died, Juan. I just talked to his close friend, and they need $2,500 to claim the body, cremate, and save the ashes for his daughter back in Mexico, and on and on and on. And so just because people were coming to us, we started broadcasting these needs to email groups of our friends in the neighborhood, the epicenter of the epicenter, as the media were calling us, but this is our home, this is our neighborhood. And this is like pretty key. I think we can give half of this, is what I said, because like I said, I was a comfortable CNN executive. But if you start to get 10 of these, at some point you're like, gosh, I'm gonna go broke. Like, this is not a sustainable way to help a community. And so my husband and I said, should we just do an email newsletter where we could surface some of the needs of the community, connect them to people who wanna help? And I run one of the biggest newsletters at CNN in the business. It has more than 2 million users. It's called the 5 Things newsletter from CNN. If I can't figure out helping my neighborhood right now, what good am I as a neighbor, let alone as a journalist? And so we launched Epicenter. Now, significantly, this was April 10th. We launched Epicenter in July of 2020. Does anyone know what happened in between that might have changed how we launched a media company or a newsletter or a community initiative? Anyone? George Floyd. So we had plans to launch a newsletter, and then came the death of George Floyd. And in an immigrant neighborhood like Jackson Heights, to not reflect on, even though this is something I'm doing in addition to my job at CNN, right? I didn't plan to leave and kind of make this my life. Remember, I still had a very cushy job and a nice desk, even though I was working from home. The death of George Floyd did change our framing of a newsletter to the extent that in our first issue, we said, while a lot of media are questioning objectivity or whether they can say Black Lives Matter, we're very clear on where we stand. Black Lives Matter, we want to stand up for our neighbors. And that's how we launched, just because it felt like you couldn't do something for the community without reflecting what we were coming out of, and a lot of potential, like, what are you doing this for at the time? So it did, of course, as you heard, turn into a business. So we launched that newsletter in July. At the time, CNN approached me, and I'm just giving you the real story of how this stuff works. My contract was up at the end of the year. CNN approached me and said, here's more, right? Here's more money, here's more people, here's more power. And partly because of the pandemic, and definitely because of the death of George Floyd, I just faced my own reckoning in my career as to whether I was going to help CNN get to a place of valuing diversity, of changing our journalism to more service-oriented journalism because of COVID, or was I going to try to reinvent my own path, or was I going to try to carve out another path? And I looked to this newsletter as something that really was making me feel such purpose. And just to give you a sense of CNN, like, our numbers are enormous every day. You would, in the morning meeting, say we had like 20 million uniques yesterday, or really big numbers. That newsletter I just showed you, that first newsletter, the food pantry up the street said, Mitra, we really love what you're doing. We just got 6 donations of diapers in size 3 and 4, which is exactly what we needed. And yet that feeling of being called from the church up the street that does the food pantry was like something I had never felt when I'm reporting on 20 million users coming to us every day. And so there was something about that at the same time that CNN is saying, here's more and more and more and more. And it's not dissimilar to what I assume many of you have gone through the pandemic and through the months and years after the death of George Floyd. Just in that simple question of like, what are we doing this for? And who are we doing this for? And so I said to CNN, I've loved working here, but I think I'm gonna try to give this Dinky Queens newsletter a chance. And Jeff Zucker, who's the president, or was the president of CNN, we could talk about that later too, was very gracious and said, tell me how I can help. I'm really sad, but I am really happy for you, and you seem to know what you want, which is really key. Now the question, when you decide you've figured out what you want, is how do you pay for it? And since I'm at the Loeb Lecture, I felt like, given Marshall Loeb's background at Fortune, I must front and center tell you how Fortune made all the difference for me. So I'm deciding to leave CNN. I have some savings. I'm going to launch this, Dinky Queens newsletter to be more. But how am I going to pay my mortgage, right? How am I going to put food on the table for my kids? And so 3 things happened. One is Fortune said, we're looking for a workplace columnist. It'd be once a week, and do you think you could do this? And so I just want to give you context. Like, I'm a senior vice president at CNN. I just did my humble brag slide. I've written a bunch of books. I stayed up till 2 in the morning with 25 column ideas, and I sent them samples, and that's how I got the columnist gig. I do know Alan Murray, who's the president of Fortune, but I didn't do any of that like backhanded stuff to get the column deal. And then the second thing was that the Nieman Foundation was doing a fellowship that was remote, so I wouldn't have to go to Boston, and it was to research ideas for racial equity in journalism. And so I applied for that, and that kind of helped me pay my mortgage even more. And then the third thing is that the Philadelphia Inquirer turned to me and said, would you like to be on our board? It was a paid board seat. And I said, this is a great way for me to understand. I just told you all I needed kind of lessons in business management to understand, how do I look at a balance sheet? And that's the board that I joined. And this essentially enabled that first year of Epicenter. So I am going to pause here because I believe Michael Loeb has just joined us. But I promise, I hope that was like a cliffhanger, because you guys know I can pay my mortgage, and then I'll get to the next year in a moment. So
thank you, Mitra. As they said in old-timey TV shows and radio programs, we have to take a break to meet our sponsor and the person who makes this all possible. We are so delighted that Michael Loeb is here with us. Michael is the founder of loeb.nyc, an incredible organization that you heard about already in multiple introductions. But I just want to tell you that Michael's one of the most interesting, engaged, and influential people in the startup scene in New York City. And we're so lucky that he is investing in Stony Brook and at the School of Communication and Journalism, and that he has come all the way out here in the middle of his very busy day to share a few words. So please welcome Michael Loeb.
Thank you very much. It's not that it was difficult to get out here. It's difficult to get out here on Valentine's Day, and I'm wanted back in the city, so I, as you can imagine. So I will, by necessity, keep my remarks, if you will, brief, which is, of course, you don't know how lucky you are for that, frankly, and because I am, after all, the sponsor, and sponsors are uniformly boring, right? Like, who's ever said, except for the Super Bowl, I really want to watch the commercials, and that's kind of me. For those of you who don't know who Marshall Loeb is, I am his son, and there's just me and my sister, and Marshall was a very, very special person and journalist, and he would regard very, very highly everything that you guys are doing at Stony Brook and everything you stand for. And Marshall was born in Chicago and joined Time Inc. at a time where they didn't hire very many Jewish people, and they certainly didn't hire Jewish people from the University of Missouri. It was distinctly Presbyterian and distinctly Yale-y at the time. And so he always stood for not the underdog, but he stood for equalizing things, giving everybody equal opportunity. He was, when he was at Time magazine, he put, there was a Man of the Year cover. They still have that, but now it's Person of the Year or Thing of the Year or Computer of the Year or EIF on the Year or NFT of the Year. But he put on in the 1970s, a composite picture of about a dozen very important women around the world, for which, after the fact, during the time, that was a very, very brave and breakthrough thing to do, but after the fact, he was criticized for that because everybody was saying, what does that mean? Like a dozen women equal one man, but that was really not the point. It was at a time where, in this society at least, women were second-class citizens, and he was very, very assertive about hiring women and promoting women and making them managing editors of various magazines. And so he would have thought a lot about the diversity of Stony Brook and indeed the mobility of Stony Brook. Stony Brook is, I'm sure you all know this, #1 in the country of all colleges and universities when it comes to mobility, which is a really, I think, important and noble thing. So Marshall, while he didn't go to Stony Brook, would have appreciated Stony Brook and appreciated the work that the college is doing, the university is doing, and would appreciate that today, more than ever, journalism is incredibly important and has certainly changed. In Marshall's day, the coin of the realm was Walter Cronkite and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, maybe the LA Times, and that was the record of truth. And now, with the democratization of voices, there's no truths anymore. There's 10,000 voices, and they're all very, very shrill, kind of because in order to get notice, you have to be shrill, and also there is no editor anymore. There's no governor. There's nobody checking facts to make sure that they happen to be right. In my dad's day, Time magazine, literally, they had a fact checker, and you had a red pencil, and you had to check every single word. And if it was a quote, you had to go to the source of the quote and get that confirmed that that person actually said all that. Things are changed, but the need for the truth, the need for being able to examine the facts and get to the facts and report the facts, that has never gone out of fashion, and that has never been more important than it is today. So you really are doing extraordinary work, and thank you for choosing Stony Brook and journalism as a path of, if not a career, at least, at very least, interest. And because, again, I can't imagine anything more important in this day and age, and I can't be happier about supporting the effort in the way that I can. So thank you all for listening, and sorry that I love storytelling, by the way, and I wished I could regale you with a whole bunch of stories about Marshall. You know what? I'll regale you with one, just one, about Marshall, okay, about my dad. But he was a young journalist, and he asked to be stationed in Germany, where he met my mother, who was a Pan Am stewardess. We were allowed to call them stewardesses back then. And German, as in born in Germany, and Catholic. And of course, he was Jewish and American. Not a popular decision to get married for either family. And my mother came from a family of means, and my dad came from a family of non-means. which could lead to other stories. My grandfather had a business, and for those of you, anybody here know the show Red Fox, Sanford and Son? Okay. This was the Jewish version of Sanford and Son. It was, Sadie, I'm going to visit you. Anyway, but it was the Jewish version of that. And my dad escaped that to go to the University of Missouri, the journalism school, quite good even today. And then he wanted to go to Germany. He wanted to go to Germany, and he asked to go to Germany. He got a job with UPI International, asked to go to Germany. He wanted to see firsthand how could that country with the most assimilated Jewish population turn on its own as violently and as awfully as it did. And while he was in Germany, there was Senator Joe McCarthy. Anybody know Senator Joe McCarthy? He was the one who was trying to prosecute communists around the country. And his undoing was he said he had this big list of communists in the government, and everybody pressed him to show what that list was. And it was 264 assistants to assistants to assistants. He was insinuating that it was, you know, at the very tippy top, and when everybody saw the list, that was the end of Joe McCarthy. But Joe McCarthy and his lawyer, Roy Cohen, who, by the way, was a dastardly figure, went to Germany to go to American libraries at American bases, and they would show up and they would say, we want to see all the books written by communists. And there were some very famous authors who were quote unquote communists, which meant that they had a friend who went to one communist meeting and then there was a cocktail party, right? But they were going around Germany, barnstorming Germany to these American libraries, and the intent was, the stated intent was, they were going to gather all these books and have a book burning. And at the very first whistle stop with Roy Cohen and Senator Joe McCarthy in Germany, a young reporter showed up. And the young reporter said, I'm here for the book burning. I want to see if you're going to grab all these books from the library and bring them out to the courtyard and burn them just like the Nazis did for all the Jewish books. So are you going to do that? Because I'd like to take pictures and I'd like to report on your book burning. And wouldn't you know, but Roy Cohen and Senator Joe McCarthy backed down. And that young journalist was my dad. And I didn't know about this until I was reading about it in a book about Roy Cohen, Despicable Roy Cohen, which talked about this. And they mentioned the journalist by name, and I said, oh my God, look at that. But journalists can change the world. They can change the arc of history. They can change minds. They can take people that are, you know, dumb and determined to go in absolutely the wrong direction. And they can change not just public opinion, but the arc of history. And that has never been more important than now. Never important than now when, you know, Putin is amassed on the border of Ukraine, that President Xi is doing the authoritarian things that he's doing. Never more important than now to get a record of the truth. Not opinion, not 10,000 opinions, but the truth and report on the truth. And you're really doing some incredibly important things. And thank you for maintaining that legacy. All of journalists past owe you a debt and have to give you credit. And thank you again for honoring the legacy of my dad. And I couldn't be more pleased to be before you. And thank you personally about that. Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you so much, Michael. I just wanted to get a photo of the two of you.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael. All right, here, let's go this way.
Here we go.
Is this okay?
Yeah,
All right.
perfect. Thank you. All right. Nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
I look for the photographer.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
See ya.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that story about your father. So I am going to try to pick up, but I'm not going to look elegant about this because, you know, the problem with opening with vulnerability is that you just like keep it going. So by the end of this lecture, I feel like you're going to see me in all sorts of different ways. All right, let me just get to where, oh, there we were. Okay, I'm just catching up to myself here, and I hope that's okay. All right. So we were talking about how I pay my mortgage and how I put food on the table. Okay. And so that was kind of the first year. And then I promised, and this was like my favorite part of my lunch meeting with students this afternoon, is that for the first time on a journalism campus, I was asked about revenue models. So Stony Brook, kudos to you for imbibing one of the questions that like journalists really need to enter the field asking about, but rarely do. And I'm just very, very impressed. So, so how do I go from kind of piecing this newsletter together to creating a full-fledged media company and a multimedia company, and knowing the populations that we're trying to serve, and what I promised you in the beginning of a lot of our communities in Queens are not on Twitter, they're not even on the internet. How are we going to serve them? And yet, I just told you my primary distribution was email newsletter. So a few things happened. Epicenter, after I left CNN, or kind of in that transition, we launched 2 more newsletters. One was a pop-up newsletter called The Unmuted, which was devoted to pandemic-era schooling. And we didn't intend for this to be the next thing we launched, but we surveyed our audience. And the benefit of launching so small is that we could kind of ask them things like, hey, what would you like to hear more about? And parents said, we don't know if New York City public schools are going to open in the fall, in September of 2020 or not. Could you help us get through this? So this launched as a pop-up newsletter and actually remains one of our most engaged products today. Its open rates of that email are consistently above 50%. The industry standard is about 20 to 25% is like a good number. So that just gives you some perspective on how much parents are trying to figure out remote schooling, mental health issues in their kids, but also what are the guidelines? Do I need to test to my kid? If a sibling has COVID, can the other kid go to school? You know, basic things like that. The third is one of our most bougie products, which I'm not afraid to admit. It's called the Escape Home, and it's a newsletter for second homeowners, which is actually a big market out here on Long Island. And the Escape Home is $99 a year. It just, again, timing of businesses and products is everything. We launched that as a soft launch 2 weeks before Airbnb's IPO. We didn't plan that, but what happened as a result is that there was suddenly a surge of interest in this kind of new space of travel, hospitality, and real estate. And so this newsletter squarely serves that market. It's national, although we do feature global stories every now and then. But at $99 a year, you can see a sustainability proposition for that. How does the rest of it work? So, and you'll see another slide when I get to URL media, but I do think for those of you who are entering newsrooms, understanding how the newsroom makes its money might seem almost like too basic a question in the interview, but actually increasingly the answers to that are changing. So in our case, we did early on find great redemption from the Ford Foundation calling us and saying, we love what you're doing with this pandemic newsletter. If we gave you $100,000, what could you do with that? And so the Ford Foundation gave us some money. We were able to make some investments just in staffing and to kind of, you know, keep growing that newsletter. Borealis Philanthropy has a racial justice fund. They also came to us and said, we really like what you're doing. What could you do? And then this is a non-traditional relationship, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A maybe a little bit later. But New York City Health, the vaccine work that we've been doing was mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a subsequent slide. But New York City actually said, what you guys are doing is really what community organizations need to be messaging, and they gave us a pretty hefty grant to continue those vaccine efforts. This is a really new area for a lot of media outlets. It's not traditional advertising for, let's say, New York City Health and Hospitals, like get your COVID vaccine and there's an advertisement. It's actually a partnership where we're doing a lot of the messaging, the flyering, and the actual reaching of the community. And a lot of our deliverables are essentially the media we're producing around the need for vaccines in certain communities. So that might spark questions and maybe questions about the ethics of that, which I'm happy to dive into. But it is definitely an area, especially as public health and messaging becomes ever important, that I see more media outlets getting into. Advertising, so McKinsey came forward, and a lot of their global publishing focuses on small business, the pandemic, diversity and inclusion, small businesses. And so they started advertising with Epicenter. And then finally, we launched a membership program over the summer. And this is an area that I think those of you who maybe have been subscribers to Newsday, like that's very natural, right, for a newspaper to have a subscription model. It's really, I would say, kind of still in its early phases for an outlet like ours. So we decided in the beginning that we didn't want to block off any of our content, but we did want subscribers to get something extra. So we've done convenings and are trying to figure out, is there an event series? But of course, just as we've plotted that, we're just in an age of such uncertainty because of COVID that this has been admittedly a challenging area for us. Okay, so this gets us to the vaccines that I promised we would talk about. So how did this happen? Like, how did Epicenter start vaccinating people and end up with 10,000 plus New Yorkers getting their vaccines thanks to us literally booking them? So like so much of our work, it was actually quite organic. We had done a small business ambassador program where we were profiling different businesses in the Epicenter, and each business would then have to nominate the next business. And then we would profile them and ask them questions. You guys, I'm sure, saw a lot of this in the pandemic, but how can people support you right now? What do you wish people knew? How have you pivoted your business in the pandemic? And one of the most kind of well-known restaurants in Jackson Heights is a place called Jackson Diner. When my father came to Jackson Heights in 1971, it actually was a Greek diner. Now it's an Indian restaurant. So we profiled Jackson Diner. In January of 2021, as my parents were getting their vaccines and I was just helping navigate that, my friend Sayu calls us like #1 immigrant daughters, because she was like, no parents would have gotten their vaccines without daughters in the month of January. And she's like, immigrant daughters were all over that. So I too was all over that. Jackson Diner called me and said, we heard restaurant workers qualify for vaccines. Can you help us figure this out? And I go on the website and I was like, whoa, if you're a restaurant owner, this is crazy, because as you all know, it was kind of a Byzantine system of registration. And for many restaurant workers who were really on their hind legs for the pandemic, either they're working multiple jobs, they don't necessarily have the agency to ask for time off, or they don't have the internet connection and kind of the wherewithal, or maybe language skills or whatnot, to go through this website. And so we said, yeah, we could. And so they sent us an Excel spreadsheet, right? And we helped. And when I say we, it was like me and like 2 other people on Epicenter staff. We were just like, oh, we could help them. And the Excel spreadsheet led to the front manager saying, my boyfriend's a New York City taxi driver. They qualify too. Can you help him and his friends? And I said, of course. So came more Excel spreadsheets of names. And so word started to get around. And I share this because so much of local news is trying to figure out 2 things to communities. One is, how can they trust us? And the second is, what do people need? And we usually frame needs in terms of information. And this was a case of people who we had interviewed essentially raising their hands and saying, please help us navigate this thing. And so that's how it started with, like, I think the first time we wrote about it in February, there were 68 people who we had registered for vaccines, but that kind of opened the floodgates, because then we started writing about the lessons gleaned from that process, and more people started to come forward, and that brought us to about 10,000 by this past fall. If you really want to kind of get technical, I think we've helped more than 20,000 people, because what we started doing in that process, they always say if you teach a man to fish, it's like so much better than just handing him one. So we started doing live streams showing you how to book your own vaccine, and then we would connect with community colleges and other groups where there might be a likelihood of other immigrant daughters connecting their parents to the vaccines that were needed. So again, my distribution background at CNN, which was really like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, came so in handy just in terms of retrofitting questions to say, how do we reach the communities that most need this information and promise them the service? I share this slide because this is what ended up happening with the city contract. The city came to us and said, this is one of Queens' least vaccinated zip codes. What can you do here? And so we got a grant. And these grants are sizable. They're more than 6 figures, which for an outlet like ours is, really like, it's a revolution to have access to those types of resources. We went into Queens Village, and one thing that I was talking to your dean about earlier is that we often frame places in terms of news deserts, right? But the same places that are news deserts are also underserved. They're food deserts, they're transit deserts, and in many cases they are vaccine deserts. And so we entered Queens Village and we found only 2 grocery stores. There's one LIRR, but ridership had really tanked. And so just even the process of finding people to convene, to convey information was really difficult. We did say, if you had to get vaccinated here, what would you do? We found 2 places that were pharmacies that required online registration. And so just to speed up what happened, we finally talked to the city and said, this is crazy. We can't do this messaging. Just giving people information about vaccines still sends them to the same internet that screwed them in the first place. We actually need vaccines in Queens Village. And so we were able to bring in a van, kind of by being very squeaky wheel. And these are the numbers of who we got vaccinated. And this is still going on to this day. I just ran out of space. So we've gotten about 3,000 people vaccinated in Queens Village as a result of putting a van there, but it's also led us to have now a group that we turn to pretty regularly for questions about other needs, other services. What do you want out of your news and information? Do you want to subscribe to this newsletter? Anytime we talk about tests or other elements of COVID, we just see our open rates on those newsletters spike. And so it's kind of really changed some of our identity into that area of need-based and service-oriented journalism that is not just information alone, but is actually the service as well. My takeaway from that is that we rely a lot on the internet to reach people not on the internet. And so the process of just setting up in a park across the street from a church was really, really impactful here. Okay, so this gets us to URL, and I'm going to try to speed up just so we do have time for questions. So I'm going to be honest with you, it sucks to be tiny on the internet. And so Epicenter, while, you could see we were having massive impact, right? People love us, but it's still 6 diaper boxes. You're not getting to the 20 million numbers of a CNN. And the way that the internet works, and the way that funding works, and the way that advertising works, and kind of the way that the world of capitalism works is it rewards scale. I should say these are for-profit companies, because I saw some of you like, she's going to talk about capitalism. But I just want to be clear that Epicenter is a for-profit company. URL Media is a for-profit company, which again, I'm also happy to revisit on why in the House. So it sucks to be tiny on the internet. Epicenter's going great, and yet I keep having this feeling like it's just going to be 6 diaper boxes, and I'm not going to have access to what I know CNN is doing, right? And I hope you could tell, like, I like the good life, I like impact, I like power, right? And so I have a friend, Sarah Lomax-Reese, who runs a radio station called WURD in Philadelphia. It's a Black talk radio station. And as I was launching Epicenter, she's had this radio station for about 20 plus years. Her father was Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctor and bought the radio station as kind of this desire to give Black Philadelphia a voice. So we're comparing notes, and so much of my challenges and hers are really similar. I can't figure out Facebook's algorithm. Do they want video? Do they not want video? You know, we are telling people where to get COVID vaccines, but it's not findable on Google because we are not optimized for SEO. You know, everybody else is on Apple News. We're not on Apple News. And so we're comparing notes on just, again, how hard it is to be small. And a light bulb kind of goes off, and this is, again, post-George Floyd world, post-death of George Floyd, I should say, where we're trying to figure out what can we do that's meaningful for our communities. And launching another website felt like, well, there's been a lot of work that the ethnic and community papers and radio stations and TV channels have been doing for decades. What if we were to harness the power of all of them and not have to sacrifice what we mean to our communities in the process? So basically, how can I retain the trust and authenticity of being small, but be able to tether myself to something greater in order to achieve scale? And so URL Media is essentially a network. We have 10 partners now. Native News Online just joined us, so they're not on this slide, but we have 10 partners, and we connect advertising, and we also share content and services with each other. So just as an example, today all the URL Media partners are on Apple News. Me as Tiny Epicenter, I cannot afford a developer to get on Apple News and to do the audience pitching and the kind of proactive management that being on a platform like that takes. But as URL, we're able to do that. We came out of the gate with 7 million users across social, which I also think is just really significant because coincidentally or not coincidentally, I'd like to say this is kind of planned in the digital innovation bucket. It is so much harder to launch a business leveraging Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram today than 3 years ago. And some of that is just the platforms themselves are just not favoring publishing links and articles as they once did. But also, I think we all know the lessons from publishers that went full in on the social media thing only to be burned by saying there's really no revenue here for us, right? There's just nothing that we're extracting. And in many ways, these platforms are building themselves on our backs, right? And so that kind of wide-eyedness comes definitely from lessons in mainstream media. So I promised more on the revenue slide. This one goes out to Amaya, who asked me that very smart question. I hope she gets extra credit about how does revenue for URL work, or how does revenue for this media company work. So some of it will look familiar. Grants, Meghan and Harry were name checked, and that's been great. Also great, though, is the International Women's Media Fund, where when we had no funding the December before we launched in 2020, they said, we don't have a lot of money, but if we gave you $25,000, like what could you do? And we said we could launch a website and announce ourselves to the world. And so I do think if any of you are ever thinking about doing your own thing, we've just found such support from people who say, we can't give you a lot, but would this much help you, is kind of among the best things you can hear when you're like really starting out small and scrappy. Advertising, we do have shared ad campaigns with brands across our networks, which are, I mentioned earlier, radio, print, web, live streams, and audio, podcasts. Content partnerships, so this was an example from Black Music Month, where content from WURD is then set to music and goes out on social and reaches the 7 million strong that I referenced. And lastly, this is a burgeoning, unexpected area, but really does give you the power of a B2B business and has made me understand the economics of Silicon Valley much better. We run a recruiting, executive coaching, and placement arm, and we serve mainstream media partners. We've made about 25 placements over the last year. It's a growing part of our business. And also kind of seeks to continue to grow BIPOC media talent and grow our pipeline for the sake of continuing to have media that is thriving for us, by us. So the need for mainstream media still, and then I think we're gonna wrap up and move on to questions. Oh, actually, there's a few other, all right. How are we on time, Shri? I'm so sorry to, okay, we're good. A few minutes, okay. So I mentioned that Fortune was where I started doing my column. Recently, I shifted over to Time Magazine because the workplace column not only became really popular for Fortune, but kind of became popular for everybody as we were trying to figure out what's the future of the workplace, the remote versus in person, but also what is the role of work in our lives today is some of what I write about at Time. I talk a lot about still needing the mainstream media as Black and brown media organizations because they amplify our messages, quite frankly. Like, I know that, just as an example, eviction will be a story a good 6 weeks before CNN gets to the story, right? Because I'm on the ground, I'm smaller, but it's not until we see this take off in national news that we often get the policy and more kind of widespread attention that many of these issues deserve. Our hope is eventually URL Media, in partnership with these outlets, can get there, if not at the 6-week earlier mark, maybe like, could we get there 3 weeks earlier, right? Is there a version of trending news that we represent that is akin to what the platforms have been able to tap into for more community-based news? I think it's also just worth talking, because many of you are in positions where you're evaluating where you're going to work and what you want out of work. What does it mean to build a company in the pandemic, after the death of George Floyd, dealing with a generation that is really centering different things in their career than perhaps I did 20 years ago, right? These are like some pictures of things we've done. Like, this is our volunteers who helped get 10,000 New Yorkers vaccinated. Like, we had them over in our yard. Those are the bags that we give food pantries. That's our in-person events in Queens Village. We try really hard to hire from the community that we're serving. That's really, really key. I want to talk about centering Blackness for a moment, because I think a lot of companies talk about it, and it might be helpful just to put concrete action around that. So what does that mean? I'll give you 2 examples. One, URL Media is 51% held by Sarah, my co-founder, and 49% by me. I'm the CEO, but it really felt important that we are a Black-owned media company. The majority of our company is owned by a Black woman. When we talk about centering Blackness, if we're looking for vendors like a graphic designer, and someone on our team says, here's a list of 3 people, what do you think? And we'll be like, is there a diversity within the organization that's all about diversity? And so these are really kind of complex questions, because for an organization that is fronting diversity, we center diversity in everything we do. We're a company for Black and brown media. How do you make sure you're actually centering Blackness in that company is something that I'm so committed to. Almost as, well, not almost, but absolutely as proof that it will take non-Black people to center Blackness in their organizations. I just wanted to make sure that I was concrete on how that can happen, but I really am constantly looking for ways to continue that dialogue. We also believe strongly in this value of lifting on the way up and not thinking about, well, when we get there, we will, and then have a long list of kind of idealism. Just as an example, last year when we were pricing out healthcare as we were about to hire our first people, we went back and forth, and Sarah called me up one day and she said, I think we should pay for 100% health insurance. And I said, well, I won't disagree with you considering my family's about to go on this, but what prompted this? And she said, well, we talk about Black and brown lives all the time. What greater way to show value for health, wellness, and life than by really putting our money where our mouth is. And so there are things like that that just in terms of building a company are among like the parts of my day where I feel like, oh, it's never been like this anywhere else I've ever worked. This could be revolutionary. Like, those are the parts that are so worth it. And I'm happy to come back to these themes in Q&A because I know we're getting there. Just some other digital trends. This company has been in the news. Does anyone know what they're looking at right now? A Peloton bike. I really did feel like this week that Peloton has made such news for any digital media company to think that supply chain does not relate to them. I mean, it's something that I've been studying quite closely. The war for talent, but not just the war for talent, but even the very public way that Peloton's layoffs went down have made me think a lot about companies, including mine, that are scaling up very quickly, but then how do you constantly pivot with skill set and with a very, very, erratic consumer is just another question that I constantly have. And then I think, talk a lot about the Luddites and kind of the non-digital world, and constantly, in the effort to be digital first, are we leaving people behind? The good news, and so many of you who came tonight, and also just earlier with the smaller group I met with at lunch, really make clear to me that purpose is everything. And that gives me so much hope for both what I'm building, but hopefully what many of you, if you're not building your own companies, what you are about to go join in jobs across the media. It's worth noting Ben Smith, the New York Times columnist who's now going to go launch his own company, was one of our most prolific Epicenter volunteers, and so he sent me this text just saying, I just got another woman vaxxed, you really created such an essential service. And then another woman who works in public health and was one of our volunteers, and she said, I wanted to reach out because I'm hitting a point at work where burnout has set in and I need to do something more meaningful. I've realized that the last few months volunteering for Epicenter was truly the most rewarding part of my year. And so as we talk so much about the public understanding how media work, I can think of no greater way than to actually bring them closer to the process of journalism as we're redefining it. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to questions.
And have a seat, Mitra.
Have there? Okay.
Mitra Kalita, ladies and gentlemen. Is it awesome? Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. Please come up to the microphones. We're recording, so we'd love to hear your questions. Mitra, thank you for giving us a perspective into a company unlike almost any other that most of us are familiar with. I wanted to note that I worked for a company that had a female CEO, journalism school at Columbia in 1993, and then never worked for another one again till I came here, and Dean Linenfeld and now President McInnes. And there's something about female leaders that I have seen up close in terms of how they center empathy, how they center doing important work. Can you talk a little bit about that? And when some people might not take that seriously, talk about women in the role of as leaders.
So I think some of it is biological because we literally are wired and tethered in my case, definitely tethered to, something much greater than ourselves. So there's that element. I mean, I thought about it in leadership a lot. I think what you're describing is empathy for staff, but also empathy in the building of products that reflect the notion of something being greater than self. There's two other ways it's manifested itself in my life. And this, I think, is relating to newsrooms, because at some point someone will ask you to do something that feels wrong. And it might be, change something in a story. It might be, unpublish something. It's going to happen at some stage of your career. And I've found that when I'm contending with that type of decision, I'll often think about, now this is a lot of TMI, but my kids still sleep with, not the oldest one, she's 17, she doesn't sleep with us anymore, but I have a little one who co-sleeps, right? So she would be in my bed, and at the time of somebody asking me to do something that I was really struggling with, she was 5 years old. And I was thinking how every morning she would cuddle up into my space, and there was something so pure about that moment, and I decided I never want to do anything that compromises that purity. And so it's almost like I feel, again, I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but I really do feel like I have a covenant through my kids to the rest of my work to kind of conduct myself in a way that feels grounded and serving, and also not to sound like Mother Teresa or anything, but pure. Am I trying to do things in the right way? The second way that it comes up, which is not well, maybe this is where you were going, just the ability to keep a lot in my brain at the same time of kind of multitasking, right? And really running a business or running a large team requires you to keep track of a lot at the same time. But really important as a manager is how people are feeling about things. And I think that empathy is also, I don't want to say it's innate, because I do think I've had to like study in order to accomplish more, but I think a lot about communications that at least make people feel a part of things as opposed to alienated from processes. And that actually allows me to do more at the same time.
Awesome. Let's get some questions, folks. Please come up. Don't be shy. Please ask your question. I do want to ask you, since you mentioned purity, some people in the audience, both now and recorded, who see your work may say, this isn't pure journalism. The kinds of things you're doing are against everything we were ever taught, that there's a line between the business side and the editorial, and you know everywhere that that's going. So talk about that, and did you have any reservations about doing what you've done, which I think is so important?
Yeah, so in many ways, the name of the lecture, Marshall Loeb, has like such a great pathway on being really well known for personal finance columns and like really in the news you can use realm. And I don't think anybody's ever said to the Wall Street Journal, you guys publish personal finance coverage or stock tips, and that's unethical, right? Whereas in my case, I'm like, I tried to do journalism the pure way. I went to a zip code that you all told me needed information, and I found out that it's not information that's going to get to the desired outcome. Actually, there is a lack of services. Now, another approach to that would be to write the story uncovering the lack of services, which I think journalism has been doing for a long time now, except that the finger pointing has also not resulted in change at the pace that we are in a moment that feels, present tense, so do or die when it comes to COVID, that I didn't feel like doing that story was going to result in the action. And so that's essentially how we ended up in this place. Now, are there other services I think we could be providing? Absolutely. I mean, and I think some of service journalism still continues to rest on information being the answer versus the actual service.
Okay, thank you. Please tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Christine. I'm a junior student of journalism. All right. You said that Epicenter-NYC works with the consulting firm McKinsey and Company. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. In 2021, McKinsey paid nearly $600 million to settle investigations into its role in the spread of OxyContin in the opioid pandemic. In December, NBC News reported that McKinsey has a commercial relationship with the Chinese government, despite the latter's facilitation of the Uyghur genocide. It also reportedly had a role in the increase of prison violence on Rikers Island, made $20 million from consulting work for U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and has given the Saudi government names of political dissidents even after the murder of journalist Kamal Khashoggi. So what led to Epicenter's relationship with McKinsey, and where does McKinsey fit into Epicenter's commitment to ethnic diversity?
Sure. So I think it's a really good question that our readers have had as well, and I do respond to every single one of them. There's two ways to address that. One is that our contract for Epicenter is with McKinsey Publishing, which publishes their insights. So it's in the areas that I just itemized in terms of small business, the pandemic. They're all related subject areas that we greenlight before they enter our newsletter. The second is that many of the areas that you're discussing for McKinsey have actually been addressed by departing McKinsey executives that faced, in at least two of the examples that you listed, were reprimanded for their behavior there and have left the company. So I do think that a part of what you're seeing, and this is just me extrapolating, you're seeing McKinsey supporting a number of news outlets right now. Epicenter, there's a new outlet called Puck. There's Charter and the Time matchup that I just talked about. And I believe Scroll India, and there's a few other like just new media upstarts where I do think in part of McKinsey's trying to support media and businesses doing good, you're seeing an effort to change kind of their own narrative there. I would also say that from an advertising perspective, the policies that we use are, there's like a name for it, and I'm happy, if you want to give me your email afterwards, I'm happy to send you. We have like a public link to the advertising guidelines that we follow so that they're not having control over our editorial content, and it's also labeled as well. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Hi, Mitra, Barbara Selvin.
Oh, hi, how are you? I can't tell with the mask on, but it's so good to see you.
Good to see you. So I wanted to ask you about the choice to go for-profit versus nonprofit. And I in the class that Shri and I take turns teaching on the Changing News Business, where we talk about business models all the time, we talk a lot about the Institute for Nonprofit News, and I believe Documented, which is one of your partners in URL Media, is part of INN. So it seems like URL Media is kind of the for-profit version of the Institute for Nonprofit News. So that's kind of like
It's a great question.
My questions are.
So URL Media's members, I believe if you had to break it down, it's like 6 are nonprofit, or maybe it's 6 are for-profit. It's like almost half and half. So 5 would be nonprofit and 5 would be for-profit, or maybe it's 6 and 4. So nonprofit media outlets very much are partners, we share content, and in many cases, they've actually asked Epicenter for like, what does your media kit look like, and can we just copy this part? And we're very, a part of being a part of a network is that you don't need to hire the person who I just paid to do this, 12-page deck, like please go and take it and, do with it what you will, customize to your own company. URL Media is for profit because we really do understand that wealth creation for our communities is a really important part of our identity, and also that money is power. And so much of what I've talked about, I hope you're also hearing, is that we don't necessarily just want to see our communities as a charitable component of something you have to do, but in many cases, small businesses, and this is a very similar reasoning for Epicenter, I want small businesses in New York City to be our customers, right? I want small businesses and their uplift in fortune and their ability to grow to be a part of our growth strategy, and I worried that by formulating as a nonprofit, it would limit the money, it would limit advertising, and it would also just limit the ability for me to bring in other businesses as partners, as opposed to I think they're called sponsors in the nonprofit world. So that was an important part of our formation. I will say that we didn't know philanthropy would be as generous as it's been, and I'm so grateful for it. And in some ways, the timing of our companies, Epicenter being a small business run by people of color, and URL Media being also run by a Black and brown woman, we've been able to benefit from a lot of philanthropies that say, we do know we need to give for-profit companies run by people like yourselves operations, because my runway is going to be different than someone who's inherited family wealth, right? My runway is going to be different than someone who says, I was I'm not even going to say a brand, but like I, was the editor here, and suddenly venture capitalists are like lining up to give you money. That's just not been my experience, and it's so sad that Michael Loeb left because I could catch up with him later. So I just want to be upfront about like we have benefited from philanthropies filling a gap, which has also made us wonder, do we want a nonprofit arm? And then the other thing I would say is that our recruitment business, while it's lucrative as a B2B arm, it's also clear that from a candidate's perspective, we're hearing from so many candidates of color who say, I want to understand the secret to advancing my career. And I do see value of that being supported by nonprofit or philanthropy in a way that's divorced from the B2B recruitment efforts that we've been doing, because those are really, you're serving a client at the end of the day.
Thank you. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
More.
Last question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Ruberg. I'm the editor-in-chief at the newspaper on campus here, The Statesman, and recently during the pandemic, we had to stop printing our newspaper, which we've been printing for over 60 years. So it was a big shift for us, and we've been coming up with more ways to come up with digital revenue instead of printing and having advertisers in the very traditional sense of news. So, but we're all students, and we are journalism students, so we don't really have that business background to find digital revenue streams. Where would you recommend we start as students, finding that
That's such a good
digital
question.
revenue stream?
I mean, I think all of us, this is actually like something I'd love to talk to you about in the future. I think we need to grow that talent because we want business side folks that are sticking up for media companies. We don't just want to inherit, folks in the business school, I mean, not necessarily, right? I think you want to grow a little bit of that talent. One place at Epicenter, we just hired a part-time revenue manager, is a woman who ran a small business in our community, and she had to shut it down. Well, she sold it to a chain of furniture stores. And she has been phenomenal just because she knows how to land a sale, which comes from selling furniture, but also she knows our neighborhood and what she needed as a small business owner in order to get the word out about her company. So just like her marketing brain from that hustle is very legit. And I think, in the same way that so much of us who've been advocating for diversity in newsrooms ask folks to think about non-traditional hiring, I actually think we need to take a lesson from that in business backgrounds and others who we're trying to bring into our fold. And so you might find people who, like maybe someone worked in their family business or in retail or other aspects of exposure to business that might not fit, like they might not have sold ads in the way you're looking for, but they have the right hustle and framework to be able to, sell your brand.
Thank you. I appreciate
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say to the students that Mitra taught me a very important lesson many years ago. She came to a panel at Columbia that she won't even remember, 200 students there, and she said to everyone, here's my email address. I'm at Newsday. I am always looking for writers. And she gave her email address to the entire room. I talked to her 3 months later and said, did you ever hear from anybody? And she said one student reached out and she got 6 bylines. Yeah. Nobody else in a class of graduate students wrote to her. And so I asked the students, why did you write? Well, we thought everybody would write. We thought she wasn't serious. She was just joking. Like, there were all these reasons that people, so my real suggestion to you, everybody, is, first of all, get to know her. You have her email. Give it one more time. Mitra
at url-media.com.
And follow her on Twitter at Mitra Kalita. And whenever you have a chance with a guest speaker, follow up, connect. When they say they want to help you, when they want to talk to you, they want to share ideas, they really mean it. And they love hearing from students. So please take advantage of that. And let's give Mitra a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Oh my God, nice stuff. Thank you.